He had not spoken a word to her since she stepped off the stagecoach, a small figure in a foreign land clutching a single, worn wooden box. The bargain had been struck through letters, stark and practical, sent across an ocean. Thomas Blackwood needed a wife to manage his house and be a mother to his child. The matchmaker in San Francisco had sent him a photograph of a woman named Lynn, her face a smooth, unreadable oval. He had sent back the money for her passage and a short, formal agreement. Now she stood on his porch, the Wyoming sun beating down on the vast, empty plains that stretched in every direction. He was a tall man, made taller by his silence, his shoulders stooped not with age but with the weight of things unsaid. His gaze swept over her plain, travel-stained dress, missing the determined set of her jaw. "The house is through there," he said, his voice rough as unsounded wood. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder and then turned, walking toward the barn without a backward glance. That was the welcome. That was the bargain. Lynn watched him go, a pillar of lonely strength against the endless sky. She took a steadying breath, the dry, dusty air so different from the humid coast she had left behind. She had almost nothing, but she had her dignity. She picked up her small box, its contents the entirety of her worldly possessions, and stepped over the threshold into the dark, quiet house that was now her home. The door did not close with a click of welcome, but with the hollow sound of a space waiting to be filled. She stood in the entryway, letting her eyes adjust. The air was thick with dust and the faint, lingering scent of sorrow. This was her new life, a silent arrangement in a silent house, and she would meet it as she had met everything else, with quiet endurance, one small thing at a time. The house was the shape of a wound. Dust motes danced in the slivers of afternoon light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating a home that had been kept, but not lived in, for a very long time. A fine layer of grit covered every surface. In the main room, a large stone fireplace stood cold and empty, even in the summer heat. A rifle was mounted above it, and next to it, a small, faded portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to haunt the very air. Thomas's first wife. Lynn felt a pang not of jealousy, but of deep, aching sympathy for the man in the barn and the ghost in the house. She found the kitchen at the back. It was a large, functional space, but it was clear it was used only for the most basic of needs. A sack of flour sat in a corner, a half-empty bag of beans next to it. The cast-iron stove was black and cold. Later, a small girl with her father's serious eyes and her mother's fair hair appeared in the doorway. She could not have been more than 6. She held a corn-husk doll with a missing arm and simply watched Lynn with unnerving stillness. "Hello," Lynn said softly, her voice feeling too loud in the oppressive silence. The girl did not answer. She only stared, her expression a perfect mirror of her father's guarded appraisal. That evening, Thomas came in from the barn, his face streaked with dirt and sweat. He washed his hands in a basin on the porch, the sound of the splashing water sharp and clear. He put a plate of cold beef and a hunk of dry bread on the table for himself and another for the girl, whose name he had yet to mention. He did not set a place for Lynn. She stood by the cold stove, her hands clasped in front of her, and said nothing. She was not a guest. She was part of a transaction, and she understood that her place had not yet been earned. She would eat later, alone, what little she could find. The silence at the table was a physical presence, broken only by the scrape of forks on tin plates. The girl, Clara, ate with a solemnity far beyond her years, her eyes occasionally flicking from her father's closed-off face to the still figure of the woman standing in the shadows of the kitchen. The next morning, Lynn rose before the sun. She found a plain light pink prairie dress and a clean white apron among the few things in her wooden box and put them on. They were simple, practical garments, a uniform for the work ahead. She did not start with the kitchen, with the challenge of the cold stove. She started with the dust. With a damp rag and a bucket of water from the pump, she began to wipe away the accumulated grief, one surface at a time. She cleaned the windows, letting the bright, clear light of the high plains pour into the house for what felt like the first time. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. She did not touch the portrait above the fireplace, nor the small, personal items on the mantel. That was a boundary she understood instinctively. By midday, the house felt lighter, the air cleaner. Clara watched her, a silent shadow trailing her from room to room, the cornhusk doll clutched tight. Lynn did not try to speak to her, but she left a clean rag doll she had stitched the night before from a scrap of cloth on the child's bed. When Thomas came in for his midday meal, he stopped dead in the doorway. He looked around the clean, sunlit room, his eyes taking in the gleaming floors, the clear windows, the absence of dust. His gaze was sharp, searching, as if he expected a trick. He looked at Lynn, who was quietly stirring a small pot of rice on the now clean stove, a simple meal for herself. He said nothing. He took his bread and jerky and went back outside to eat in the shade of the barn, but he walked slower this time, a thoughtful furrow in his brow. That afternoon, Lynn tackled the kitchen. She scrubbed the stove until the cast iron shone. She organized the pantry, taking stock of the meager supplies. She found yeast and flour that was passable, if not the best quality. With practiced, efficient movements, she began to knead dough. The simple, rhythmic work was a comfort, a language her hands knew better than her tongue. Soon, the unfamiliar and wonderful smell of baking bread began to fill the house, a warm, living scent that pushed back against the lingering chill of sorrow. It was the first small act of defiance against the silence. The smell of fresh bread was a curious thing on the Blackwood ranch. The few ranch hands, leathery men who communicated in grunts and nods, stopped their work and sniffed the air. They exchanged glances. Nothing had smelled like that coming from the main house in years. When they came in for their evening meal, expecting the usual hardtack and salted meat, they found a pot of simple but hearty vegetable stew simmering on the stove, and a loaf of fresh, crusty bread sitting on a clean wooden board. They looked at Thomas, who looked at Lynn. She stood by the stove, her expression calm, her hand still. She simply gestured to the pot. An old hand named Jeb, his face a roadmap of sun and skepticism, was the first to ladle a bowl. He took a bite, then another. A slow nod of approval was his only comment, but it was more than he had said all week. The other men followed suit, filling their bowls and tearing off chunks of bread. A quiet, appreciative murmur replaced the usual stark silence in the bunkhouse mess. They ate every last drop. The next day, there were scones. Light, fluffy, with a bit of dried apple she had found in the back of the pantry. The men devoured them with their morning coffee, their gruff exteriors cracking just a little. Young Tim, a boy barely old enough to shave, even managed a shy, "Thank you," his face turning beet red as he ducked out of the kitchen. Lynn simply nodded. The children were always the first to trust. Clara, who had been a ghost in the corners of the house, began to materialize by the kitchen door. She would stand there for hours, watching Lynn's hands as she chopped vegetables, kneaded dough, or stirred a pot. She never spoke, but one afternoon, as Lynn was rolling out pie crust, Clara silently pushed her cornhusk doll across the floor toward her. Lynn paused. She looked at the doll, then at the girl. She wiped her floury hands on her apron, picked up the doll, and placed it carefully on a stool, "So she can see better," Lynn said softly. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched Clara's lips. That evening, a scrawny, one-eyed cat that had spent years treating the ranch with disdain, sauntered into the kitchen as if it owned the place. It rubbed against Lynn's legs, purring like a rusty engine. Lynn poured a small amount of milk into a saucer and set it down. The cat had found its new allegiance. One by one, the defenses of the wounded household were being breached, not by force, but by the gentle, persistent aroma of good food and quiet care. Thomas Blackwood was a man who noticed things. He noticed the way the wind shifted before a storm, the slightest limp in a horse's gait, the tension in the herd before a stampede. And he noticed the changes in his house. He noticed the quiet contentment that had settled over his ranch hands, the way they lingered over their meals instead of bolting them down. He noticed the sound of his daughter's soft humming coming from the kitchen, a sound he had not heard since her mother died. He noticed the light in the kitchen window burning late into the night, a warm, golden beacon in the vast darkness. He said nothing. Acknowledging the change would be to admit the depth of the lack that had preceded it. It would be giving a name to the hope that was cautiously, terrifyingly, beginning to take root in his chest. But he acted. One morning, Lynn found a sturdy set of new shelves in the pantry, the raw pine still smelling of the forest. They were perfectly measured and level, built to hold the jars of preserves she had started to put up. Another day, a fresh side of beef appeared on the kitchen table, a finer cut than they usually bothered with. A broken hinge on the kitchen door was suddenly fixed. A rickety chair was made solid. These were his words, his acknowledgement. They were offerings left at the altar of her quiet competence. One afternoon, while taking inventory, Lynn opened a new sack of flour delivered by Mr. Abernathy, the portly supplier from town who always had a story and a smile. The ledger, which she had found tucked away in a drawer, showed Thomas had paid for the highest grade. But the flour that sifted through her fingers was coarse, gritty, and cut with cheaper cornmeal. She frowned. She checked the ledger again, her brow furrowed in concentration. The numbers for sugar, for coffee, for salted pork, they seemed high for the quality of goods she had seen. A small, cold knot of unease formed in her stomach. It was a detail that did not add up, a discordant note in the quiet rhythm of the ranch. She filed it away, in the same careful, methodical way she stored her recipes. For now, she would say nothing. She would simply watch. The crisis came, as they often do on the plains, without warning and on the back of a choking cloud of dust. A massive cattle drive, thousands of heads strong, had been forced to change its route due to a dried-up riverbed to the south. Their trail now cut directly across Blackwood land. The trail boss, a weary man named Peterson, rode up to the ranch house with a dozen exhausted, dust-caked drovers. He took off his hat, his face grim. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, "we're in a tight spot. My men are worn to a frazzle and my cook wagon hit a rut and broke an axle. We need to rest the herd and the men for 3 days. We'll pay for the trouble, and for any supplies you can spare." Thomas looked at the throng of hungry, tired men. It was more than a request, it was a necessity. Turning them away was not an option, not in this land where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. But his own larder was not prepared for an army. He had his own men to feed, and now, a dozen or more extra mouths, all of them with the ravenous appetites of men who had been on the trail for weeks. He felt a familiar wave of pressure, the weight of responsibility settling heavy on his shoulders. He glanced toward the house, toward the kitchen where a steady, quiet competence now resided. He saw Lynn standing on the porch, her hands wrapped in her white apron, her expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met across the dusty yard. In that instant, he was not a rancher making a deal with a trail boss. He was a man with a problem, looking at the only person he thought might have a solution. He gave Peterson a slow, deliberate nod. "You can water your herd at the creek," he said, his voice steady. "Your men can make camp by the cottonwoods. We'll see to it they get a hot meal." As he spoke, he kept his eyes on Lynn. He saw her give a single, almost imperceptible nod before turning and disappearing back into the house. The bargain was struck. The test had begun. The entire ranch, and its unexpected guests, now depended on what she could create within the 4 walls of that kitchen. Lynn did not panic. She did not rush. She moved with the calm, focused energy of a general preparing for battle. The kitchen, once a place of quiet solitude, became her command center. The first thing she did was take a complete inventory. She laid out everything she had: sacks of potatoes and onions, jars of preserved beans and tomatoes, slabs of bacon, and the side of beef Thomas had brought in. It was a lot, but for nearly 30 men for 3 days, it was not enough. So she improvised. She sent young Tim to the bunkhouse to gather any of the men's personal stashes of coffee or sugar, promising a fair trade in scones. She dispatched Jeb, the old, skeptical hand who was now her most devout follower, to the creek with a fishing line. She even bartered with Clara, trading a promise of a small apple tart for the girl's help shelling peas. The stove, which had once been cold and silent, now roared to life before dawn and did not rest until long after dusk. The first night, she made a massive pot of beef stew, rich and thick with potatoes, carrots, and onions, stretching the meat further than anyone thought possible. Alongside it, she baked 6 large loaves of dark, hearty bread. The drovers, who had been expecting cold beans and hardtack, ate in stunned, reverent silence. They came back for seconds and then for thirds until the pot was scraped clean. The next morning, they awoke to the smell of frying bacon and coffee, and a mountain of flapjacks so light and fluffy they seemed to defy gravity. For lunch, there were meat pies, with a flaky, perfect crust that crumbled at the touch. For dinner, roast chicken she had sourced from a neighbor's wife, served with mounds of buttery mashed potatoes. Scones appeared at mid-morning, biscuits at mid-afternoon. The ranch, for those 3 days, was transformed. It was no longer just a patch of dirt and a place to sleep. It was an oasis. The weary, hardened drovers softened. They started to smile. They played with Clara, showing her rope tricks. They helped Jeb mend a fence, unasked. The atmosphere of exhaustion and desperation was replaced by one of quiet gratitude and deep, bone-warming contentment. On the final morning, as the drovers prepared to leave, the trail boss Peterson came to the kitchen door, his hat in his hand. He looked at Lynn, who was already kneading dough for the day, her pink dress smudged with flour. He said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been driving cattle for 30 years. I've eaten in fancy restaurants in St. Louis and field messes in the war. And I can tell you, I have never, ever had better food than what you've given us these past 3 days. You didn't just feed my men. You gave them back their spirit." He pressed a heavy pouch of coins into her hand. "This is from all of us." Lynn looked at the coins, then at the man's honest, grateful face. She pushed the pouch back toward him gently. "No," she said softly. "You pay Mr. Blackwood for the supplies. The cooking was not in the bargain." One evening, after the last of the drovers had ridden away and a semblance of quiet had returned to the ranch, Thomas found Lynn sitting on the porch steps, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon. The air was cool and smelled of sagebrush. In her hands, she held the small, worn wooden box she had arrived with. The lid was open. He saw that it contained only a few things: a pair of silver chopsticks, a small jade pendant, and a faded, creased photograph. He hesitated, feeling like an intruder on a private grief. She looked up and saw him there, and for once, her face was not a calm, unreadable mask. It was etched with a profound and gentle melancholy. She did not hide the photograph. Instead, she held it out for him to see. It showed a smiling man and woman standing behind the counter of a small, busy eatery, surrounded by steaming bowls and hanging ducks. "My father and mother," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We had a small restaurant in our village. It was not grand, but the food was good. Everyone was always welcome." She traced the edge of the photograph with her finger. "My father taught me how to balance flavors. My mother taught me how to make a little go a long way. How to feed many with just enough." The story tumbled out, quiet and unadorned. A drought, a fire, the loss of everything. The impossible choice that had led her across an ocean to a man she had never met. It explained everything: her skill, her resourcefulness, her habit of asking for nothing. She was not just a cook, she was the inheritor of a legacy of hospitality and survival. As she was putting the photograph away, a wagon rattled into the yard. It was Mr. Abernathy, his face wreathed in a practiced, jovial smile. "Blackwood," he called out. "Heard you had a small army pass through. Good thing you're my best customer. I brought you a fresh delivery, just in time." He gestured to the back of his wagon, loaded with sacks and crates. He caught sight of Lynn and his smile tightened. "And the little lady," he said, his tone condescending. "Still making those strange little cakes." He turned back to Thomas. "You have to be careful, my friend. A palate accustomed to simple, honest fare can be ruined by all these foreign spices." The menace was in the pleasantry, the warning wrapped in a jest. He was reasserting his claim, not just on Thomas's business, but on the very character of the ranch. Thomas felt a cold anger rise in him, but before he could speak, Lynn stood up, her back straight. She met Abernathy's gaze, her own clear and steady, and said nothing at all. Lynn did not rise to Mr. Abernathy's bait. She did not defend her cooking or her heritage. She simply turned, went back inside the house, and let the screen door swing shut with a soft clap. But a change had taken place. The quiet unease she had felt about the supplier had now solidified into cold certainty. He was not just a cheat, he was a threat, a man who used smiles and handshakes to disguise his contempt and his greed. That night, long after the house was dark and silent, Lynn lit a single lamp in the kitchen. She took out the old ledger she had found and opened it. Then, from her own small wooden box, she took out a thin, clean notebook and a freshly sharpened pencil. She had bought them in San Francisco, a small extravagance, for keeping accounts. She had not known then how vital they would become. She began her work. One small thing at a time. Every morning, before she started the day's baking, she would go through the pantry and the larder. When Abernathy's deliveries arrived, she was there, a silent observer in her pink dress and white apron. While his men unloaded the sacks and crates, she would take a small sample of flour between her fingers, smell the coffee beans, check the color of the cured meat. Then, in the quiet of the night, she would record her findings in her own ledger. On one side of the page, she copied the entry from Abernathy's bill, £100. Premium white flour. On the other side, she wrote her own assessment, coarse, mixed with corn. Approx 20% loss in quality. She did this for everything. Grade A sugar, damp, clumped, poorly stored, prime salted pork, excessive fat, underweight by 5 pounds. She was creating a second set of books, a testament of truth written in the language of household economy. Thomas would sometimes see the light from the kitchen burning late and find her there, bent over the table, her brow furrowed in concentration. He never asked what she was doing. He had seen the look on her face the day Abernathy had insulted her. He had seen the quiet, unshakable resolve. He was a man who understood that some battles are fought not with fists or guns, but with patience and meticulous care. He started leaving an extra lantern filled with oil on the kitchen table before he went to bed. It was his way of standing guard, of letting her know she was not alone in her vigil. The end of the summer brought the day of reckoning. It was the custom for Mr. Abernathy to come out to the ranch at the end of the season to settle the accounts for the entire summer's worth of supplies. He arrived in a polished buggy, dressed in his Sunday best, a large leather-bound ledger tucked under his arm. He was confident, jovial, ready to collect the substantial sum he believed he was owed. Thomas met him on the porch. "Abernathy," he said, his voice flat. "Come into the office." Abernathy beamed, clapping him on the shoulder. Of course, of course. Always a pleasure to do business with you." Blackwood. They sat at the heavy oak desk that had been Thomas's father's. Abernathy opened his ledger with a flourish, the pages filled with his looping, confident script. He ran a finger down the long column of figures. "A busy summer for you," he said cheerfully. "What with the extra hands and all those drovers?" "The total comes to..." Before he could name the exorbitant figure, Thomas held up a hand. "One moment," he said. He stood, walked to the door, and opened it. "Lynn, would you join us?" Lynn entered the room. She was wearing her clean pink dress and white apron. In her hands, she carried her own small, neat notebook. Abernathy's smile faltered. "What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered. "This is business between men. She is my wife," Thomas said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And she manages the household accounts." He pulled up a third chair, placing it right beside his own. Lynn sat down and placed her notebook on the desk next to Abernathy's grand ledger. She did not speak. She simply opened it to the first page. Quietly, methodically, Thomas began to read from Abernathy's bill. June 5th. £100, premium flour. He then looked at Lynn. In a soft, clear voice, she read her own entry. June 5th, £80 received. Poor quality, mixed with cornmeal. They went on like this, line by line, for sugar, for salt, for bacon, for coffee. Thomas's deep voice stating the charge, Lynn's quiet voice stating the truth. Abernathy's face went from red to pale. He stammered, he protested, he blustered. But he had no defense against the quiet, irrefutable arithmetic of Lynn's ledger. It was all there, the small, accumulated thefts that amounted to a grand betrayal. When they were finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Abernathy was defeated, not by threats or violence, but by the quiet dignity of a woman with a pencil. He shoved his ledger into his satchel and stormed out without a word. Thomas and Lynn sat in the silence. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the fierce intelligence in her eyes. He had married her for convenience, but she had given him honor. Later that day, he found her in their bedroom, standing before her small wooden box, which sat on the bed as it always did, packed and ready. He walked over and gently placed his hand on the lid, his fingers covering hers. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a question. "This is your home, Lynn," he said, his voice rough with emotion. He finally said her name as if it were a precious thing. "There is no need for this anymore." With a slow, deliberate movement, she unlatched the box. For the first time since she had arrived, she began to unpack. She took out the silver chopsticks and placed them on the dresser. She took out the jade pendant. And finally, she took out the faded photograph of her parents and set it on the small table beside their bed, right next to the portrait of his first wife. The house was no longer wounded. It was whole. Thank you for watching.